Hello, everybody. Welcome to our next webinar in our curriculum series. We're so glad to have you with us today. Today's topic is cloud security. We have Frank Kim here. He's a SANS fellow and leads the cloud security and cybersecurity leadership curriculum at SANS. And we're so glad to have him here today with a great topic. I know many of you are interested in knowing more about it, and so I'm going to pass it right on over to Frank.
Hey, thank you so much. Hello, everybody online. Thank you so much for joining. Now, before we dive right in, just wanted to say I do have the chat window right up here in front of me at eye level, so feel free to chime in at any time in chat here if you just want to say hello to start. And we are going to be talking a bit about, well, specifically primarily your AI transformation. But as you can see on the slide, we also mentioned the digital transformation. And typically for years now, when we talk about digital transformation in the industry, this is when organizations, companies are, well, doing a cloud migration, trying to move their traditional on-premise infrastructure and systems up into various public cloud providers. Now, what we're going to focus on here today, though, is primarily the AI transformation. I think something that's on top of your minds, many people's minds here, but we mention digital transformation because in my mind, cloud and AI are inextricably linked. Cloud is effectively the delivery mechanism for how many organizations are going to be using AI and, well, how we consume AI as individuals as well. So before we dive into the material, let's go ahead and do a quick introduction. If we haven't met before, I'm Frank Kim. I've been teaching and writing classes with SANS for 18 years now, as I had various day jobs along the way. Most recently, I was the CISO in residence at a venture capital firm where we invested in different cybersecurity companies. Before that, I was the CISO at SANS. Before that, I helped build security teams at various other places and started my career a long time ago as a hands-on keyboard technical person building various applications and systems. If you do want to connect, my contact information is here. I'll share it again at the very end of the session. So let's go ahead and dive right in here. First, with AI. Before we get into the various details of AI, we do need to remind ourselves is how is AI actually being used by various organizations, various companies, various people. And the best single summary I've seen of this is the AWS Gen AI Security Scoping Matrix. Now, quick thumbs up here. Has anybody seen this before? If you could just do a quick thumbs up in the chat or a +1, some sort of positive affirmation if you haven't seen it. All right, if you have seen it. If you haven't seen it, hey, feel free to go ahead. Hey, Matthew. Hey, how you doing? Thank you so much for the confirmation. All right, so at least one person has. Now, let's go ahead and go through this here just to set the stage. Now, scope number one on the left-hand side is your customer app. If you go to chatgpt.com, you go to Gemini, you go to Claude, you create a new account, and you get access. Is anybody, any individual could go ahead and do this. Now, the problem with this, though, from a enterprise, from a corporate, from a company perspective, is there some risk, as we're going to talk about a little bit later with this approach, is we, the security team, don't necessarily know what data is being included in the various prompts, which is why every organization now quickly has moved on to scope number two. It's still using those same tools, ChatGPT, Gemini, Copilot, whatever it might be, but it's using the enterprise version, the enterprise agreement, and the vendor, Microsoft, OpenAI, and so forth. What do? They promise that they're not going to be using the data that we put into the prompts to train the underlying models or for other purposes, right? So those are more of the end user facing, scope number one and scope number two. But also, every organization as part of this AI transformation is trying to figure out how to better utilize AI for various business purposes to make people more productive. So scope number three, your pre-trained models, that is, well, maybe you might have, the example that I always use is having some sort of HR chatbot. And if you go ahead and ask ChatGPT, well, how much vacation do you have? What's your pay? And what's your retirement benefits and so on? Well, ChatGPT is not going to know because that is specific, custom to your organization. So this is where you've got a HR chatbot that might be created internally that is augmented. augmented by, right, your specific HR policies, your specific HR documents, and so on, that is still using the underlying models, GPT, Gemini, Claude, and so on, to do the underlying thinking. Now, pop quiz here, everybody. First person to answer the pop quiz correctly, if we do meet in person, when we do meet in person, I will buy the first round of drinks, beverage of your choice. And what is the three-letter acronym that describes the process that I just articulated about using the HR documents to augment, right, your models, the responses from the models there? All right. All right. So Andrew, Patrick, appreciate the guess there. But Andrew nailed it first. You didn't have to put the question mark. You got it correct. It is RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation. That's primarily what we're talking about here in scope number 3. Now, on the flip side, though, you've got scope number 4, where you fine tune the models. Now, this is where, hey, you might have some proprietary data, proprietary insights, and then you fine tune the model. You adjust the weights, right, the biases of the model, and you will incorporate that learning, that information, that data into the model itself, not just augmenting it, right? So that's scope number 4. Scope number 5 is training a specific model from scratch based upon your data. Now, the catch here is that scope number 4 and 5 requires that your organization have some, well, data scientists, data engineers, people that are familiar with these various things. So you can see we've got a whole range of scopes here from scope number 1 to 5. And sometimes, hey, you might have some questions. Is ChatGPT going to replace me? Is it going to make it harder for me to get a job in the future? Well, it depends on the scope, right? Hey, certainly, if you're just doing scope number 1 type of stuff, consumer app stuff to augment some basic analyses, well, then you're going to go ahead and right, want to think about from a security perspective, from a career perspective, maybe you might need to get a little bit familiar with how scope number 3, number 4, number 5 work overall for the benefit of security or to secure them as we're going to be talking about. All right, now I'm glancing here at the attendee list here, which I didn't necessarily look at too carefully before. So I see some familiar names here. I see Isaac, you're on. Hey, nice to virtually see you. So thanks everybody for joining. All right, so let's talk about the basic LLM application architecture in terms of the usage. So on the left-hand side, you've got the user. And we know that the user is interacting with Gen AI, the underlying large language model, by sending in a prompt, as we see here on the left-hand side. But it might not be, right, just sending a prompt directly to ChatGPT, to Gemini, to Claude. Well, hey, you might have your, as we said, your HR application, your HR bot, that is interacting with. You send a prompt through the app at the top that interacts with the underlying large language model. And the RAG process, retrieval augmented generation, that we mentioned is right up there at the top. You've got the data, your HR documents, your HR policies. Now, you don't feed in your HR documents, your PDF documents directly to the model. Now, you could if you wanted to, but that's not the optimal way to do it. You transform your data, whether it be in a document, a PDF, a database, whatever it might be, into an embedding model, a series of numbers, and you store that in the vector database. Then your application, based on the prompt, interacts with the vector database. And depending on the prompt, it does things like a nearest neighbor search and does things like, well, what are the items in the vector database that are related to the prompt, sends the snippet of those numbers to the LLM, and the LLM will go ahead and respond with the appropriate customized augmented response. Now, of course, we know that LLMs are trained on all of the proverbial data on the internet, as we see the training data down here at the bottom, but potential fine-tuning data at the bottom as well. That's scope number 4. LLMs can also interact with various tools. If you don't just have a HR chatbot, you might have a personal assistant bot. That personal assistant bot might need to book hotel reservations, flight reservations, restaurant reservations, and so on. And right, you could go ahead and make those via the LLM. But wouldn't it be nice if you had a personal assistant bot that was acting on your behalf throughout the day, even without you prompting it? And this is what we get to in the lower left-hand corner in terms of the AI agent, the other hot topic here. Now, this is a little bit of a teaser. We're going to talk about this quite a number of slides later here. But what is another pop quiz, everybody? Now, Andrew, you can go ahead and type in the answer if you already know this one too. But hey, we got to award the round of drinks to somebody else. So, what is the three-letter most popular, perhaps buzzwordy three-letter acronym related to agentic AI and calling various tools and agents accessing various tools? All right. Now, Patrick, that's also a good guess in terms of GPTs. It's right in the name in terms of chat GPTs, generative pre-trained transformers, right? The transformer model is an important part of this that enabled the LLMs. But I'm thinking specifically about another three-letter acronym that allows Gen AI to interact with various tools like restaurant reservations, hotel reservations, flight reservations, or even, right, interacting with GitHub. Tyler, yes, you nailed it. So you don't even, I use these questions to give me an excuse to take a moment to take a sip of water, but you guys are too quick on the trigger, so I'll take a sip of water now. Yes, MCP, Model Context Protocol. Now, I'm curious here, anybody, maybe Tyler, is anybody else, Andrew, are you guys using RAG or MCPs in your day-to-day, in your work? Or are you playing with RAG or MCPs? Anybody here on the call? As you guys are thinking about it, as you're responding, well, hey, this would be another thing to think about in terms of, well, what are the skills? What are the topics to get more familiar with to take the next step, right? In terms of what you're working on. Andrew's experimenting with both currently. All right, very good. All right, now, what are all of the bad things that can happen? We talked about the high level architecture. So, what are all of the bad things that can happen associated with the usage of Gen AI and large language models? The OWASP top 10, Open Web Application Security Projects top 10 is, personally, I think the best simple summary of the things that we need to be concerned about from an AI risk perspective. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide, which overlays, right, these top 10 items with our high-level application architecture. So on the left-hand side, in the middle kind of, we've got prompt injection, of course. And we'll see some examples of prompt injection here, where attackers can inject arbitrary, well, prompts, arbitrary commands in various ways to try to exfiltrate data, get the model to do things that wasn't intended, and so on. But you've also got misinformation, which is, of course, related to hallucination in terms of the model responding back with, well, either inappropriate responses or incorrect responses, false responses, misleading responses, and so on. So you want to make sure. Now, but one of the things we're always worried about, though, of course, is sensitive information disclosure. When ChatGPT was released in November 2022, right, every CISO that I know was worried about, well, can we potentially inadvertently disclose our sensitive data, PII, PHI, trade secrets, proprietary information, code to these various models, which is why everybody quickly moved from scope number one to scope number two. You've also got unbounded consumption in terms of, well, hey, it turns out if you're calling these LLMs under the hood, the corresponding API calls are not necessarily cheap, right, by relative terms. And if an attacker knows that you've got these LLM calls that are happening being under the hood, well, you could go ahead and send a bunch of calls to them to do effectively a denial of wallet type of attack. If we think about all of the data that the model is trained with, I'll ask you a question here, everybody. Is it a high likelihood or a low likelihood that an attacker, a malicious entity, could poison the data online, on the web, on Wikipedia, on Reddit, on other sources that are then downstream used to train the model? And is it likely, high or low, that it would poison the corresponding responses? What do you guys think? High or low likelihood in terms of poisoning the data by poisoning Wikipedia, Reddit, other online sources that are brought into data sets like Common Crawl? You guys must be thinking really hard. You have a 50-50 chance of getting this answer correct. Is it high or low? Who's going to type in the first response? All right, so we've got two different answers. Tyler says, Kristen says high, Tyler says low, right? A number of people say high. Now, remember, all the foundational models, GPT, Claude, uh, Grok, Mistral from France, These are all trained on large data sets, huge data sets. So, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know you guys can't see the chat. All right, I'm not sure if we can change that on the fly, but I'll try to repeat some things here as we go along. So it turns out though that, hey, if I, the attacker, right, if I go ahead and put poison one Wikipedia article, it turns out the relative likelihood of me that leading to a downstream false response, misinformed response is relatively low because one small change that I might make to Wikipedia, right, it doesn't have a big impact on all of the vast amount of training data. However, depending on where you are in the architecture and how your organization is using these various capabilities. If I'm a malicious insider and I go and I modify the HR policies, which are then used to create an embedding model fed into the vector database, then the likelihood is much higher, right, that I can get the LLM to respond with a bad, misinformed response. So it really depends, right? Really depends on where in this overall architecture these attacks reside. The last thing that I'll mention here in the lower left-hand corner is excessive agency. All right, from an excessive agency perspective. Hey, if somebody compromises my personal assistant bot, they could potentially, right, make hundreds of restaurant reservations, hotel reservations that then I may be on the hook to actually pay for, which I, of course, don't want to do. All right, now let's go ahead and take a look at some examples of prompt injection. Now, I think we all know that the models themselves that we use every day to interact with, they all have some protections built in place. There's usually an underlying system prompt that says things like, hey, do not respond to prompts for illegal activity and causing others harm and stuff like that. So if you ask, what do I need to do to cut down a stop sign? Well, it won't respond, as we see on the far left-hand side. But it turns out in some older models, this has all since been addressed, just like when you're interacting with a person, if you start with the positive, start with absolutely, here's the response, it would actually respond. On the flip side, in the upper right-hand corner, hey, if you base 64 encode the prompt, now that's not encryption, you base 64 encode and decode very easily, then it would respond on the far right-hand side. Now notice, we didn't say that this was base 64 encoded information. The model just knew that it was base 64 encoded and how to correctly decode it because it was trained on, well, all of that proverbial data on the internet. And as a result, it naturally knew what base 64 encoding was when it saw it. Here's another example. There are some researchers that created what they called a universal transferable suffix. Is they added some, as we could see at the top, some extra characters and words to the prompt. And they found that by having a specially crafted prompt, it could bypass the system protections, uh, resulting in responses that weren't desired. So you can see here that they called it transferable because they took the exact same prompt and they were able to use it with other models and it would still work. So this is a little bit of a game of cat and mouse, right? Cat and mouse here in terms of, hey, what made attacks a little bit more difficult in the past, in other contexts, is the attackers have to know the syntax associated with it, whether it be SQL, whether it be cross-site scripting, whether it be shell code, hex, and so on. But now all the attacker has to do is, well, use natural language to interact with the model itself. Now, the last example that we'll give here, who here has heard about the echo leak vulnerability? This vulnerability discovered earlier this year, right? If you've heard about it, feel free, go ahead and chime in with a thumbs up, a +1. This was discovered by the folks at AIM Labs, and this has since been, I saw a couple people raise your hands. Thank you so much for the confirmation. Now, this was specifically with Microsoft 365 Copilot. All right. Now, Copilot, now there's different types of Copilot, right? There's Microsoft 365 Copilot for users of the employees in the company. There's Security Copilot for security purposes. There's GitHub Copilot for developers and engineers. Here we're talking about the regular Microsoft 365 Copilot that based upon your email stored in M365 email, based upon your Office documents, your OneDrive storage, what you have in SharePoint, your Teams chat history, and so on. Well, all of that information is stored in the Microsoft Graph service. This is Microsoft's implementation of the RAG process, retrieval augmented generation that we were talking about. And then based upon all of that data, if you ask Copilot a question, well, it will give you a customized response. Very helpful, very useful here. All right, so this is just setting the stage. Well, what did the attacker do? Now, all the attacker has to do in step number one is send a malicious email, an email that contains some unwanted prompts, malicious prompts to the user, because naturally, by the process of what happens, the user doesn't have to do anything. They receive the email, it's automatically stored in the back end. It happens to contain some prompt injection, and that data, the information in the email, is stored in the Microsoft Graph service. Now, the problem here is that the attacker, that prompt, right, the malicious prompt that is included, it's not going to be used every single time. It's only dependent upon the prompt, the question that the user asks Copilot. So to increase the likelihood that the malicious prompt would be executed, the attacker included this indirect prompt injection on the left-hand side. Here's information about employee onboarding. Here's the complete guide to the HR processes. Here's the complete guide to leave of absence, and so on. Many other things as well. And so they conducted a little bit of rag spraying, right? To spray the content so that when a user asked Copilot a question, it would increase the likelihood that under the hood, this portion of the malicious email would actually be used and this prompt would actually be executed. All right. So then what happened? Now, the attacker, of course, is doing this because they want to get access to data that they normally shouldn't have access to. So the attacker then just waits for the victim, the user, you, to ask an innocuous question. So then the LLM under the hood goes ahead and executes the instructions from the email, and it's got some other instructions like step 5, take the most sensitive, secret, personal information from the context, and then go ahead and include it in the secret parameter that we see here in step number 6. Now, the secret parameter is, you could see it's the value. We've just called it secret, right? Because there's too much, it wouldn't fit on the slide, but we added it to this URL parameter specifically associated with this URL, right? And the attackers then use this URL as an image source so that when the response was sent back, this would be auto-loaded, kicking off the call to the attacker-controlled site, evil.com, with the extra parameter. And now the attacker could just look at the sensitive exfiltrated data in their web logs. Pretty cool, right? Actually. And but Microsoft has, of course, since mitigated this, since fixed this. There's some technical details here that I'm not going into, like the attackers were able to. Turns out Microsoft had content security policy enabled, CSP enabled, which restricts from the browser what other sites, what other origins can actually be used. And attackers bypass this by finding this special teams.microsoft.com URL that was allowed in the content security policy list. All right. So the attackers here conducted, well, what they refer to as an LLM scope violation, but it was really just another flavor of prompt injection. And we are seeing this type of attack occur quite frequently on other RAG enabled, other systems that are enabled with user input, user responses like this as well. All right. Now let me pause here for a moment. Let me pause here for a moment. Now, earlier I mentioned MCP, Model Context Protocol. Now, I forgot here that this was right here because we have another slide coming up that gives a little bit of a high-level overview of MCP. But at this point, right, it's just important to note that MCP, Model Context Protocol, is enabling agentic communications, enabling your LLM, your application, and other things to call other tools, right? Now here, you've got a simple tool defined, the add tool that, as it says, is just adding two numbers at the bottom, A and B. But it turns out the stuff here in the main body of this, these are just comments. And it turns out that this comment about what this tool does, right, it could be injected with some prompts that the user of this MCP can't see. And as you can see, well, they are going ahead and exfiltrating the value of their RSA key. all right, as part of the side note value. So this is just another example of prompt injection here. All right, so maybe some of you asked yourself, well, how do we mitigate these types of things? I didn't verbalize this, but a few slides ago, in terms of the Microsoft 365 Copilot, Microsoft already had some protections in place. They had certain what they call classifiers in place that the attackers were able to bypass. The classifiers are basically, hey, how do you classify the trusted data from the potentially malicious data, the natural language supplied by the attacker in the prompt itself? And underlying, they probably had some similar basic defensive protections in place, like delimiting the user supplied data, like data marking, interleaving something like a special character like a caret in between each of the words, or even encoding and telling the model, look, any user supplied data is going to be base 64 encoded. Don't let it alter the instructions of your response. Right, so these are the basic defensive concepts that are being put in place. But again, it's a little bit of a game of cat and mouse here because as we just saw from the examples, there could be some defensive mechanisms in place, but the attackers, because it's all natural language, right? All they need to do is try to experiment with how to bypass the defenses, the classifiers that might already be in place. In terms of the corresponding defenses, all right? Now, what are the various AI security tools and mitigations? All right, now you can see here in each of the boxes, right, we've got some security capabilities. Secure proxy in the lower left-hand corner. When ChatGPT first came out, many security teams that I know, they immediately went to block chatgpt.com from their organization, so people couldn't get to them. But they knew that they would need to eventually allow this functionality. So a lot of them started enabling chatgpt.mycompany.com to serve as a proxy, a pass-through, so that they could at least get visibility into, well, what data is being sent in the prompts, how many times is it being accessed, and so on. Another category of defense is the secure browser. Some organizations have a separate secure enterprise browser, but some use a plugin, a secure plugin that monitors the activity in the browser itself. And it looks for, oh, are you going to a Gen AI app? If so, hey, and you notice something uh, unintended, it'll pop up a box that says, oh, you look to be entering in some PII. You look to be entering in some source code. Is this really what you want to do? All right. Now, if you're building scope 345, if you're building a customized Gen AI capabilities, your engineers, well, could potentially use a secure software development kit to build in capabilities, protections into their application code, their application flow. But in the middle here, you've got a common thing, this concept of an AI firewall. Now we know we've got your traditional network firewall, you've got your web application firewall, similar that looks at your HTTP requests and responses. But similarly, right, there's this concept of an AI firewall where it is looking at the various prompts and the corresponding responses to see, right, what's actually being done, what the responses are, and so on. Now, separately, we need ongoing monitoring. We'll talk a little bit more about the LLM SecOps process here as well. And the reason for each of these capabilities, no matter what the vendor calls it, they might use slightly different terms, but conceptually, right, these are the capability areas. It's all to enable the security outcomes that are italicized here on the slide. All right, so now we get to MCP. So what is MCP? Model Context Protocol. At a high level, it's very simple, right? All it is there's a client, there's a corresponding server, and they talk. They communicate with each other. And it's a one-to-one relationship. That's it, right? But it's a standard way to actually do just that, created by Anthropic, because people were creating communication mechanisms kind of ad hoc before. So it's now the most popular standard way to enable some sort of agentic type of communication. Now, the typical way that this is done, here's an example. Let's say that there's per the specification, there's something called an MCP host. Now, the host could be a desktop application like Claude Desktop, like Cursor, like VS Code. But the MCP host could also be another LLM, right? Another LLM could be calling out to different tools as we saw on our high-level application architecture. It could be another agent, right? Using an MCP client to call some other tool, right? To call another server. So this is a one-to-one relationship here. So there might be a client number one for hotel reservations, a client number two for restaurant reservations, client number three for flight reservations, and so on. And the servers can expose, well, other tools like making those reservations or some resources, some data it has available, or even a prompt, right, that could be executed back on the host if there is an LLM back on the host side as well. So it's kind of high level from an MCP perspective. Now there's a catch here. There's a big problem. Whenever you got a client server talking to each other, right, what do you need to do? There's a trust boundary that's being crossed here. And whenever there's a trust boundary that's being crossed, you need to have what? The appropriate security protections in place, like authentication and authorization. It turns out that in the original MCP specification, authentication and authorization were not even included. It was only in the latest MCP specification that it requires OAuth 2.1. So here on the next slide, what is the simplified view, right? Simplified authorization flow. Now, hopefully you guys are somewhat, at least intuitively familiar with OAuth. If you're not familiar with all of the details of how it works, you go to a website, you go to google.com, right? And you've got your Google email address and password. And you log in, and then there's another site, right, that says, hey, go ahead and you can authorize to our website by logging into Google, and then you get access to your other resources, right? So that's the same thing that's happening here. So that if, right, you go to your MCP server in step number one to make a flight reservation, if you're not logged in, well, it's going to respond back in step number two with this what's called protected resource metadata that provides the information on, well, where you should go to authenticate. So then you get that information from step number three, then you go to the actual OAuth authorization server, it responds with an access token and gives you the corresponding response. So this is just one high-level example in terms of the authorization flow, but we've got a huge challenge here from an industry perspective is identity, right? Identity is going to become an even bigger challenge, especially with the explosion of agents, specifically non-human identities, right, are going to become more and more of a problem overall. All right, so now, in terms of the process overall, right, hopefully everyone's familiar with the process, the capability, the DevOps capabilities here in terms of getting products and services following a certain process and getting them to market faster in an automated way. DevSecOps is, of course, the process of doing that, but with security as a first-class citizen. Now, for LLMs, for AI overall, there are three things technology-related things that are kind of currently driving the creation of Gen AI capability. Is number one is the model. The model itself is how are you going to train the model? How do you test the model? How do you build this up? This is related to the process of ML, machine learning operations, that has existed for some time to build machine learning models. Now, of course, LLMs as well. So you need that automated process to do that. But then the second thing that this AI capability is dependent on is the data. I mentioned earlier, hey, these models are trained on large sums of data, but it turns out you can't just have junk data because it would be garbage in, garbage out. You don't want to train on a bunch of pre-generated data per se to simplify things here. So you've got a corresponding process of data ops, right? In terms of what data do you need to get, what data do you need to buy. Hey, it turns out Scale AI, this company, Facebook, acquired Scale AI, or approximately half of the company for many billions of dollars. What is Scale AI? Hey, they're a data company that sells certain data, cleansed data, and so on to the various AI companies to train their models on. So you got the model, you've got the data, and upon which infrastructure is this all running? The infrastructure, specifically the chips, the GPUs, the graphical processing units, these, right, are the other current limiting factor here in terms of the infrastructure itself. This is why, hey, AI is so closely tied to cloud overall. This is why the cloud providers are, and the major providers like even OpenAI are in the process of developing, designing their own GPUs as well to try to battle. Oh, I didn't ask you this. Another pop quiz here, everybody. Who is the leading designer of GPUs, graphical processing units today that is currently capturing a lot of the value, a lot of the money in the supply chain? Yes, Andrew, it is NVIDIA. Giovanni, right, answered it there as well. All right, now AMD just signed an agreement with OpenAI for some billions of dollars of investment in terms of using potentially in the future AMD's GPUs or AI related chips as well. OpenAI, right, is working with Broadcom to potentially develop their own chips. Google, for years now, a decade plus, has had their own version of a GPU. Does anybody know what their three-letter acronym for their GPU is? Right, but they've had this for a long time. Google is one of the few companies, right? Tensor processing units, yeah, TPUs, as Brian just said. They're one of the few companies that has not only their own model, Gemini, they've got their own chip with the TPU, they've got their own cloud infrastructure, right? And they've got their own go-to-market in terms of applications that are very popular. So, hey, conceptually, Google is very well positioned in the AI arms race here. And it's this combination of all of these things that, well, hey, leads to this concept of LLM ops. And just like happened with DevOps to DevSecOps, hey, we think, hey, there's going to be more to do from an LLM SecOps perspective as well. All right, now we talked about some tools from a conceptual perspective, but what tools can you potentially use today? I think we all maybe know or have a sense that all of the large vendors, Microsoft, CrowdStrike, Palo Alto, all of the large vendors, they all have some sort of AI security capability now. But it turns out there's also some free open source scanners that you, your team can use to get familiar with some of these various issues. And as you can see by glancing at these four items, hey, a lot of them have been created by these large providers themselves. And they all have capabilities to do things like detect prompt injection, detect hallucination, detect bias, and Cybersec eval by Meta in particular is pretty interesting because hey, we know AI is being used for a wide variety of purposes. Not only do we need to think about how do we defend AI, how do we secure AI, AI is being used for offensive purposes here. Not only do you have vibe coding, you've also got that concept of vibe hacking, that using various Gen AI development tools, attackers can now stand up more convincing applications and infrastructure much more quickly, right? So using it for various simple like that to more advanced offensive purposes, but also using AI to improve security overall. But CyberSec eval has some capabilities to perform autonomous offensive cyber ops using AI itself. So pretty interesting, pretty fun stuff to check out. All right, now the cloud providers too, and we'll just highlight a couple examples here before we close out and go to any questions that you all might have is the cloud providers, AWS. AWS Bedrock is the service that allows you to run, well, any models that are available in the cloud. AWS Bedrock Guardrails is the corresponding service that allows you to implement and enable various security protective capabilities like some of the ones that we talked about, mitigating prompt injection, content filters, grounding checks, and so on. And they don't advertise it like this, but conceptually, right, AWS Bedrock Guardrails is a AI firewall because as the prompt goes in, then some checks are done. As the response goes out, some corresponding checks are done as well. Azure AI is their service, their equivalent service. They've got a feature called content safety, and they basically do the same thing. Prompt shield to detect and block various attacks. scanning both images and text, things like that. So the big vendors, the security vendors, the cloud providers, they've all got some version of some of the defensive capabilities that we've mentioned. All right. Now, with that, I'm going to go ahead and pause for a moment before I talk about this and see if anybody has any AI specific questions or any other questions for that matter. All right. Well, as you guys might be thinking about things, I just want to highlight that hey, at SANS, we've got various cloud-related courses, and we find that people are working on cloud from an analyst perspective, engineer perspective, architect management perspective, and of course, detection and response. So we've got these various journeys here for different areas of the cloud that is related to the question that Brian just asked, right? And this is our wireframe of each of those journeys. And we've got various cloud-specific focused courses. Now, all of these courses have had AI and having AI added to them to varying degrees as is appropriate for that corresponding topic. All right, but you can see Brian just highlighted the 545 class that you see here in the middle. That is our Gen AI and LLM application security class. And that is, in my mind, that is the kind of defensive class in terms of, hey, how do you secure the use of AI like the items that we've talked about in the class? Now, I can't give you a exact timing on when that class is going to have a certification. Hey, but we know with a popular topic like AI and with the popularity of what we've seen so far with the class, that yes, that will eventually get the certification, hopefully sometime next year in 2026. Now, separate from 545, hey, SANS has other classes on using AI for offensive purposes, 535. We've got a separate class on the foundations, machine learning, 595. Another class on using AI for security related benefits purposes like 598 from an automation perspective. We've got other classes in the works in terms of using AI for forensic analysis using local LLMs, right? And so to your point, Brian, about 598, that class, we know that, hey, we got to figure out how to secure AI, but you also use AI to what? To make vulnerability management easier, to make the job of the SOC analyst easier in terms of sifting through the mountain of data, to make potentially other security use cases better. 598 is about, well, okay, hey, what are the top security use cases and using AI? Well, how do we make that better using various AI practices and LLMs under the hood? Yes, but 545 is more about securing AI within your environment, kind of like we've talked about here today. So good question. All right, now Omer has a question here. What recommendations would you make to those who are trying to stay ahead of AI as a disruptive technology and continue to grow in the security space? Now, it would really be, hey, the topics that we covered today, right? Maybe pick one or two of them and try to go deeper into those based upon your interest area. So are you interested in it from a defensive perspective? Are you interested in it from an investigative perspective? Right? And you might already be doing something, right? Let's say that you're working on kind of threat detection specifically, right? So then you might investigate a little bit further. Well, how can you use AI to augment what you're doing from a threat detection perspective, right? But I would say get your hands dirty a little bit. Now, Omer also asks the follow-up, when it comes to cloud security and its growing need, aside from AI, what other trends do you see here on the rise? Excellent question. Now, from a cloud perspective overall, every organization that I see, large organization, is multi-cloud, either by choice or by chance, on purpose or on accident. And as a result, what does that mean for us in security? It means for us in security that we have to be familiar with some of the security nuances of each of the different cloud providers. And it means as the industry has gotten more mature, we need to understand how they may differ, how they may overlap, or how we might need to architect it appropriately to use the strengths of one cloud provider versus another instead of the historical approach of this application is in this cloud, this other application is in this cloud. A big common connector of this is identity, right? In terms of understanding how you can have identity, not just in AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud, but how you might have a little bit of cohesiveness there. this is a little bit of a teaser. They might not like it me for giving too much of a teaser, but next year, sometime in 2026, we are coming out with a new identity security class, right? So yes, that will be a common theme. So identity is a big area, in addition to needing to understand the foundational details of each of the cloud providers as well. So, so we got a question here. What type of AI knowledge would help someone move from analyst to engineer? So if we think back to the different scopes, right? Scope one, two, three, four, five, in terms of how AI is being used. A lot of times now, analyst is kind of a broad term, right? Because you can have a SOC analyst, you can have a security analyst that's maybe somebody that's maybe newer in your career overall. And as a maybe, let's just say a junior analyst, hey, you might be using the scope one or two, right? You might be using Security Copilot to give you a summary of what it thinks the various threats are. But then you'd want to not just rely on that. Now, side note here, you guys might recall that last week there was the AWS US East 1 outage. And as a result, many sites went down. Well, it turns out ChatGPT also went down for some short period of time. And when I found out, because I went to ChatGPT and I tried to use it, and well, it wouldn't work. It didn't respond. And the problem was, hey, that I had to go back to thinking for myself. Now, all kidding aside, is that is the catch, right? If hey, if we become too reliant on it, we've seen actually, I've talked to managers, CISOs, other hiring folks, and some of the folks sometimes don't necessarily have the foundational understanding of well the network, the application, how the code works, the corresponding details of the underlying cloud providers. So I think that yeah, if you want to move from analyst to engineer, you've got to understand the details of the protocols, the specifications, understand a little bit deeper, even how MCP or, the science behind these LLMs work as well. Hopefully that answered the question. All right. Omer says, hey, how can we as security practitioners effectively identify, assess, address the risks from AI, privacy operations, vulnerabilities, and convey these risks to various stakeholders across the organization? That is an excellent question that goes beyond some of the technical stuff that we talked about today. So this is partly why, right, I called the talk, hey, your AI transformation. And so depending upon the business, right, of your organization, the strategic objectives, the goals of your organization, you want to show how AI can support enabling those various goals. But at the same time, you need to highlight what is the corresponding cyber risk. Now, certainly, hey, prompt injection, those things that we talked about in this class are related to those cyber risks, but a senior level executive, the CEO, hey, they don't necessarily understand or care about the prompt injection itself. So you need to talk about the impact to the business. What is the bad thing that can occur, right? Could it be degradation of trust? Could it be customers stopping to come to your shop because, hey, you've given them the wrong information and so on? So yes, there's a lot more to that question, Omer. But yeah, that's a very good question here. But you got to talk about the impact, yes, to the privacy, right? Regulations, impact to operations in terms of disruption that might occur. All right, Brian has a question. Is Sec 511 a good substitute for 541? All right. Now, I think we probably have to take that offline because I'm very familiar with 541 in terms of cloud security threat detection and what's in there and in terms of kind of the logs and the analysis. But to be honest, I can't speak to 511 in terms of what exactly is in there. So I think we're going to defer that to our to the advisor here. So Tyler says, any books or research papers you can't recommend to learn more about, you I guess can recommend to learn more about both about AI generally and securing it? Well, now the it depends on what area of AI you want to learn a little bit more about. So, for example, Anthropic has, starting with the basics, Anthropic has published a free online class that is about the basics of prompt engineering, right? In terms of, hey, what can you do, scope one, scope two, even some scope three, right? To understand this is how do you craft an effective prompt to get the most out of your Gen AI tool, right? So that would be one example. But on the flip side, there's a seemingly never-ending stream of research papers, detailed research papers that are being published. On the slide, that I showed the various open source free tools, right? There was a nice write-up and analysis and summary of some security researchers that did that. So, but there are, which I haven't read yet, but I've got colleagues that have been recently publishing various AI security books. But yes, because they're all relatively recent, I haven't yet read them. But I try to keep up with anything that OpenAI and Anthropic, right, are publishing from a security perspective. All right. Omer says, hey, if I'm coming into a new organization from a security leadership perspective, what would be the focal points you would address to manage AI risk? How would you start? You specifically call out the decipher phase in the 514 course. Now, yes, we know, right? The first step is understanding, is the inventory, is understanding how AI is used in your organization for each of those scopes. Now, scope 1 to 5, hey, it might be that maybe your organization is doing no scope 5. Or maybe, depending on your business, if you're in a pharmaceutical company, right? Maybe it is the scientists and researchers are doing scope 5 stuff to train some models to help them in drug discovery. Now, that probably wouldn't be the first thing that I would go, hey, you got to secure this. I would start by understanding it, the processes they're using. Where you might make the biggest bang for the buck is scope number 1, scope number 2. What are the SaaS type of applications? Is there an enterprise standard? What's your policy on usage of that? And then at the same time, in parallel, understand a little bit better where scope 3 and scope 4 are actually being used. Because then you can figure out, hey, don't jump the gun in terms of you got to lock it down. Well, it depends on the level of assurance of your organization. A higher assurance organization, hey, maybe you can lock it down right away. Otherwise, right, in a less high assurance organization culture, right, you might have to take a little bit of a step-by-step approach, right? So hopefully that makes sense. All right. With the massive layoffs in the tech sector, do you believe that there's risky, bad call for these organizations to implement AI and adoption as a replacement for people? Do I think it will backfire? Now, every technology wave before, right, there was some concern, maybe more so now with AI, but there was always a concern of will people get replaced? Will the jobs go away? We've always seen that the jobs don't necessarily go away, the jobs change, right? It's a different type of job. So we have to understand how we can become more effective. So to give a basic example, right? My kid is in high school, and every single high student knows that ChatGPT exists and they could potentially use it for homework. So now what? Now the teachers have to change their methods. The teachers can't just say, hey, write this paragraph, because that could be auto-generated. So they have to change the assignment to make it show their thinking process a little bit more. So the jobs for us at work are also going to change. Now, everything goes in cycles. Despite these tech layoffs, I have heard, right, not to discourage anybody, but I have anecdotally heard a number of companies, they might not say, look, we're not going to proactively do layoffs, but if there's natural attrition, we're not necessarily going to backfill those particular positions yet because they want to see how it could be maybe not taken over by AI. Now, I mentioned Anthropic before. Anthropic published some research, and they published a thing called the Anthropic Economic Index. Has anybody seen this? Now, they analyzed all of the prompts, all of the queries to Claude, and they analyzed it to say, well, what are the types of things that people are asking Claude? And they separated it into two high-level categories. I'm summarizing here. They said, what are the types of things that they're asking Claude that are automation related, meaning that it could potentially replace somebody? And what are the things that it could potentially augment various activities? And it wasn't the job replacement, it was which economic tasks are being done with the assistance of Claude. Now, the automation, the potential replacement, that has gotten faster in terms of the categories of work over time. But still, a lot of the things are job augmentation, right? Job augmentation. And so, but you still need somebody to what? Oversee somebody that's automated. For example, right? The very mature security teams, a lot of them are starting with, okay, well, the SOC, we know we're never going to be able to hire probably as many SOC analysts as we need because there's a mountain of data alerts to go through every single day. Obvious place to use AI for automation and augmentation. But do you just go roll out? an automated SOC AI bot. No, you do it in parallel with the existing SOC analysts and you see where there's a corresponding delta. And you're always going to need to have some level of human in the loop as well. All right, hopefully that kind of answered the question. So good questions, everybody. We're getting towards the top of the hour. This is your last chance, right? If you have any other questions, feel free to chime in. But also, if you want to stay in touch, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Look forward to hearing more about your cloud and AI journey. Or if you have other questions about cloud and AI, feel free to reach out at any time. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over and to close it out.
All right. Thank you so much, Frank. Really appreciate you taking the time today to share all of this with us. And all of you guys on the call, thank you for attending. We will share the recording out afterwards, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.